edition of the Naharjito Bookathon presented in association with the Raisoni Foundation. In this session, we shall explore the book, The Play of Dolls Stories, a translation by John Vater. This book is a translation of Kaur Narayan's unusual stories that broke new ground and rejuvenated the entire genre when they first appeared on the Indian literary landscape in 1971. Half a century later, in vivid English translation for the first time, they seem just as far reaching. Sometimes in the novelty of their insight, sometimes in their transcendence, and sometimes in the world views they together uncover. By turns allegorical, satirical, poetic, poignant, playful, and bizarre, Narayan's layered, often deceptively simple tales unravel the existential and moral bewilderments of a society navigating the cold, cruel worlds of its own creation, while also allowing hope in truly human form. These bold, sometimes comic, often experimental and metaphysical stories weave love and otherness, fantasy and history, tenderness and silence, leaving us both restive and redeemed at once. Our speaker for this session, Mr. John Vater, holds an MFA in Literary Translation from the University of Iowa. The Play of Dolls is his first book in translation, co-translated with Apurva Narayan. In 2018, he was selected as an emerging translator from the United States to attend the Banff International Literary Translation Center residency in Canada. His translations have appeared in Plowshares, the Asia Literary Review, Words Without Borders, Two Lines Journal, and Exchanges. He works as a research associate at the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore. Our moderator for this session is Ms. Juhi Kumar. She is a lawyer with a passion for the creative arts and performances. She has a knack for intellectual conversations and dialogue, having won quite a few moot courts. She's a perfect balance of a technical mind and a creative heart. Now, over to our moderator to take the session forward.
Hi, John. It's an honor to meet you and talk to you about such a famous person who was an iconic figure in the Indian literature. So it's an honor to talk to you about him and the book you translated of him. So
Yes.
I hope you're excited too.
Yeah, very excited. It's wonderful being here, and I feel very grateful to have this chance to talk about the book at the Orange City Literature Festival.
Yeah. So to start with, I've made a model of questions which I thought the viewers also would like to know about the book. So I'd start. So the first question is, I've heard that you were researching in India about the Hindu literature, and that's how you came into this profession and everything. So how was your experience when you were in India? How did you like the people here and everything? I just want to know.
One of the things I think that struck me most being in India was just, how welcoming everyone is. I think that even in the U.S., if you go to different cities, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to meet people. But people would warmly welcome me into their homes and, share dinner with me. I made one professor friend, and she told me that she was surprised to learn that where I grew up in Oklahoma, that when I was a kid, I would run through the door of my neighbor's house. It was very kind of the feel. She said, "Oh, that's how it is here in India as well." So that's what I think one of the feelings I treasured most, the welcome. For the research, I did go there to research Hindi writing. I was very interested in Hindi writing just because I kind of wanted to explore what was out there. There hadn't been a whole lot, that was translated in the U.S. And even before this at college and, other places, I had started to learn a little bit more about Indian philosophy, the Upanishads, the Panchatantra, things like that. And I thought, okay, with the society, this diverse and complex, with such deep traditions, surely there must be, really beautiful and fascinating literatures in the Indian languages as well. So that was kind of at the back of my mind. And then as one aside, I was also kind of eager to escape the literary conversation happening in the U.S. So one of the things which I also looked at when I was in India was Dalit writing, and different forms of politics, different ways of thinking about relationships, power, how we are as people.
Oh, that's great. You gave a very nice gist about it. So basically, what drew you to translate these stories? Like, why these specific stories? Like, there are a plethora and varieties of stories. Why was this the specific one you wanted to translate?
Yeah, so, there are all different types of stories, and ultimately, I think a translator is kind of like a reader. We're going to translate what we like to read, um, and I have some peculiar reading interests, but I think other people might share them as well. When I was a younger person, I had lots of different questions about life, lots of different questions about religion and how the world is. And so I think some of the books that touched me, the most deeply and profoundly were the ones that kind of tackled those questions head on. So I kind of came to Indian literature in a very sort of roundabout way, where initially I got interested in translation and other cultures through 19th century Russian literature.
Oh.
I was in high school. I was reading Dostoevsky, and I also loved Harry Potter.
Yeah.
I think it was really the way, this Russian author kind of took, different types of ideas and arguments, and then, through the power of storytelling, really set them at one another. There's a sense that you're not entirely sure where the unfolding of, these ideas will go. Believe it or not, that's kind of also what got me interested in, the culture in India and other places. And I kind of wanted to go out and find writing that touched me, in some way that was similar to how these Russian stories had touched me. And if you say, okay, how is Dostoevsky similar to Kuran Narayan? On the surface, it may not be readily apparent. You have this Russian author whose books are thousands of pages long, and then on the other hand, you have this Hindi poet who is known for his preciseness and his brevity. But I do think that there are some similarities, especially in the sense of, like I said, dualism. He kind of looks at different competing ways of being, different competing types of thoughts, and he really sets them out one another so that the entire story is kind of a process of discovery. And being a translator, we're always eager to see what our readers think of our stories. And so I was scrolling through Amazon. Somebody had left a comment on the book, which I thought it was a good comment in the sense that it also kind of captured how I felt about the stories when I first read them. Which is that these are not stories that you want to race through, with the beginning, middle, and end. They somehow engage your entire mind.
Exactly.
To make you want to stop and think. Those are that's the power of the story, and that's why I was very attracted to this particular author.
Yeah, and it's been translated really nicely because I'm a reader too, and while reading it, I was actually so hooked to the story that I was just, though the stories were not related, they were all different stories, but I couldn't just wait to turn the page and read everything because it was so amazing. And yeah, it is deep. So yeah. So like your book had a lot of reviews, very nice reviews and everything. People read it, people went crazy. So in the recent reviews, the stories have been characterized in a lot of phrases. Like there was it was called an ethical puzzle. Then it was called thought of experiments. So how would you like to tell us about what these phases actually mean? Like how would you describe all of these?
Yeah, so these are really interesting stories. They're not your typical story, and that's kind of deliberately what Kuran Narayan set out to do. Like I said, he's traditionally a poet, and so he kind of approached the form of storytelling in a very poetic way.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of difficult sometimes to describe short story collection because a novel you can just say, okay, here's the plot line. Whereas the short story collections, there are multiple tales. But Narayan makes it a little bit easier, where he actually had a note to the reader at the start of the collection, where he kind of explained what it was that he was setting out to do. And he refers to his stories as romances with reality, which I thought was a really, really nice phrase. But by romance, he doesn't mean romantic.
Yeah.
It's not, a Bollywood story where, a guy with a big chest will come in and speak.
Oh, so you're a fan of Bollywood stories as well.
It's not a Salman Khan film.
Yeah, you were saying.
But he means kind of romance in the sense of the imagination. So he kind of references Don Quixote and the way in which Don Quixote is a type of romance. And one way he kind of explains it is that often we think of a story or a fiction as a type of representation of reality, like a story in the name of reality, and the story just tries to approximate that. And here he kind of flips that formula on its head, where here he says, actually what I'm trying to do is reality in the name of the story. So he's trying to create a method, a type of a mode of storytelling that allows him to get to, reality, what concerns him more directly. And of course, one of the virtues of storytelling, one of the virtues of poetry is that, the imagination lets you do that.
Oh, yeah, that's great. So you chose the play of dolls for your title story. I mean, why this? Is it something that connects all the stories all together? Why this title? Like, why the play of dolls?
So there are some different considerations at play. And the original story collection in Hindi was titled Akaron Ke Aspas, which we had translated for the title Near and Around Shapes elsewhere. So the translation, being a new book, is a little bit different, and part of the consideration was to find a story that kind of thematically touched upon all of the others. And so I think what we liked about the play of dolls was the kind of fundamental concept of the metaphor there. So I think the original title was maybe Gurion Kakeo or something like that. But the idea for a doll is often you have the puppet master, who is pulling the strings. And for a lot of the characters in these stories, there is a degree of powerlessness involved, and often, what they're forced to do and how they're forced to act is not their own decision. It happens by some kind of outside force. But at the same time, Narayan is interested in the question of premises. Like, what is the premise on which we do something? What is right and proper action? And so it also runs up against this metaphor of, the strings, controlling our actions. There's also the idea of this doll maker in the story, who actually exerts agency and, her own power in interpreting the world as it is through her art, creating the dolls. And that's a very different type of way of being, as opposed to, being pushed around by the concerns of the world. So to give the readers and listeners a sense of what the story is about, to kind of make it a little bit more concrete, the story starts out from the premise actually of compassion, where you have a passerby on the road who sees this boy, and the boy is putting on this puppet show, of all of these dolls. And then the adults, near around, just keep on kind of passing the boy by and don't really want to give him the time of day. And actually, they don't want to believe that, a boy of his size could actually fool them, with some kind of magic artistry, of this puppet show. And so the passerby, who is our narrator, gets a little bit angry, that people aren't showing the boy his due consideration. And so he decides, okay, I'm going to show some compassion and empathy, and I'll go ahead and buy these dolls from him. So this is how the story begins. But things get, much more complicated, where he buys the dolls, and then, his own self-interest gets involved, where, maybe he'll set up a shop to sell them. In the process, the boy also introduces the narrator to his older sister, who is the one who creates them, the doll maker. And actually a type of romance, develops between them. But what is interesting about, the romance is that, the two of them can't really see eye to eye. And this is, again, kind of getting at some of the duality that I was talking about earlier, with the kind of external compulsions of the world, and also a type of more kind of innocent knowledge. Where she just wants to, get to know him. She wants to kind of do this in a very kind of, direct, friendly way. And then he's constantly thinking, what will other people think? Maybe this is not the appropriate way for us to be speaking to one another. And there's actually one, nice line when, they're sitting together on this culvert, kind of talking about, this kind of relationship which is budding between them, which I think is nice and gets at this concept, which I'll read.
Okay.
So this is the narrator thinking.
Yeah, you really give a very nice explanation and a description about it. I'm sure the viewers might have understood the depth and everything you were trying to tell them. So the next thing I'd like to ask you is, what is the art of thought referred to in your session topic, and how should we view Narayan's approach to thinking?
Yeah.
Like,
So I think another thing which I was interested in these stories is that this idea of the human comes up pretty frequently. The human or humanness. But I could tell when I was reading to mean the same thing as humanity or humanism, as I understood it from the vantage point of my own culture. And so part of the excitement of translating the stories was to kind of figure out, okay, what exactly does this mean? And I think that the role of thought, plays a sizable role in this. So earlier I had said that one of my favorite authors growing up was Dostoevsky, and Narayan had also read some Dostoevsky as well. And what is kind of interesting to me about how the way in which both of them portray reason is that there is a little bit of suspicion involved, and so it tries to open up what exactly do we mean by reason. So in the case of Dostoevsky, in a lot of his books, he has this like weird preoccupation with this book at the time called "What Is to Be Done" by Chernyshevsky. And the book is all about rationality. It's all about utilitarianism. It's very utopic. And Dostoevsky kind of didn't know how he felt about that because there was a lot of psychology of people that he didn't really think that this, very mechanical rationality understood. And similarly, in some of the stories of Narayan, even though in every story it is a type of ethical puzzle, it is a type of thought experiment, he is trying to kind of use a type of reasoning and thinking to get closer to something. There are some phrases like inhuman reasoning, or contorted logic, which show up in the stories. So in the case of the play of Dolls, you have the man, who is asking why, and is thinking, so much about the world, just getting in the way of, his ability to know her. And then, all she says is, why do we have to be thinking so much about, what the rest of the world says? Like, why can't we just, get to know and recognize one another? And so I think for Narayan, there's a question not only of reason, but also perception, and also, trying to recognize the human face in things. There's a story called The Official, where you have a citizen who goes into this government office, and he's been there, 5 or 6 or 7 times, and he's waiting for his application to be processed. And he says, why can't you just give me a verdict? And then the official says to him, well, it's just government policy isn't such that we can really help you right now. And so then, as a kind of parting shot as he leaves, he says, okay, I understand very well what's being done in the name of the country's interest and not in the good of its peoples. And so I think that Narayan is a little bit uncertain or kind of questions some of the different abstractions, that we create for ourselves, which sometimes actually blur out our ability to recognize the human in one another. And my co-translator, Apoorva, writes a very nice afterword where he talks about how what Narayan is really concerned with is this question of moral evolution and the way in which this world of transactionalism we live in ends up kind of, degrading us. And so these are 2 of the core tensions that Narayan looks at. Honesty, love, intuition, feeling, but also, on the other hand, the external trappings of needs and duties, the ways in which we deceive ourselves and deceive one another. So I guess that would be the paradox that he was looking at.
Yeah. So you just mentioned your co-translator. So how was it to work with Apurva? How was it? How did you guys bond? How did you guys get through this whole thing? How was it to work with him?
It was really wonderful working with Apurva. Obviously he is the son of the author, and he has immense translation experience translating his father's poetry. He has one collection of poetry out called No Other World, and another collection of poetry which will be out shortly. So throughout the entire process, he provided me with all of the materials, and I had a lot of questions which he helped to answer. So it was very useful coming in as an outsider to be able to, tap on his deep understanding of his father's sensibility. Another thing which was useful, I think, is that these stories, as I said, are not your conventional short stories, and so translating them was really a process of discovery. And Narayan, Kukur Narayan, has an essay where he actually talks about some of the difficulties of translating different things. And he says everything that you translate is not necessarily equal. So, for instance, he says like a ghazal is actually quite difficult to translate into English because we don't have that same culture of saying wah wah wah, kya baate, things. And I think that for Narayan, part of the difficulty of translating was that kind of in the best of the South Asian literary tradition, like say the Mahabharata, you have on the surface a wonderful story which is really captivating, and yet there's a lot going on underneath. And so the real challenge was figuring out how do you translate what is unseen, because a lot of what is unseen is actually touching the Indian reader's imagination, what they understand of their own mythology and tradition. And so if you're putting that into English, which is a slightly different system, how do you do that? So it actually involved, hyper precision with words. So translating the story almost felt like translating poetry. We would have lots of back and forths, discussing what we thought the stories meant. And yet at the same time, we were trying not to let our interpretations of the stories, make the stories themselves just kind of read like dull philosophy, which they weren't. So that was definitely the main benefit. The stories, I think, are much stronger from this collaboration. And I guess to kind of sum up, people think of translation as just a mechanical exercise where you see the word and A goes to B. But actually, just as there's an art of thought in these stories, there's also an art of thought in translation. Quite a bit of thinking went into figuring out how can we best convey these stories to the reader.
So I was asking you, which one is your favorite story? I know it might be tough for you to answer that question because you have put so much effort in all of them, and you've loved all the stories that you've been translated in this book. But which one is your favorite?
That's maybe the hardest question so far. And of course, I would want to say, I love all of the stories and encourage all of the listeners to go and buy the book to read all of them. I guess I'm going to cheat a little bit, so I don't know if I have it within me to narrow it down just to one, but I can maybe narrow it down to a couple and then say why I like them.
Yeah, we're here to listen to all of that.
Yeah, so one of the stories which is dear to me is the story "The Court of Public Opinion," and I think
that's my favorite too. Sorry, yeah.
I think it was really great just because it's simultaneously really funny and comedic at the same time that it kind of touches upon a sort of day-to-day reality in India. And for the readers and listeners who don't know, there's a thief who steals a bicycle and then runs into a buffalo which is crossing the road, and then immediately all of these people kind of gather and they want to kind of adjudicate who's at fault for the person hitting the buffalo. And so the story kind of spirals out into a meditation on justice, which is really great. Another story which I really liked is the final story in the collection, which is Near and Around Shapes, and it's much more poetical and metaphysical. And you don't immediately know what the meaning meaning of the story is and the subject matter. But it has kind of, I think, a very deep sense of intimacy there, like you feel in a very quiet space when you're reading it. And so when translating that particular story, I think that I could feel it, much more than others. There's one called The Shirt, which is much more of a kind of conventional, plot-driven story. And I think that, just in terms of regular storytelling, a character gets into a dilemma and has to figure out, how to get out. I greatly enjoyed that one. And then also this story, Fear, which is about this writer at his desk, and suddenly this kind of bug-like insect entity enters the room and begins to take on different characteristics, in proportion to the narrator's fear, which says a lot about our own psychic states. So I love lots of these different stories for different reasons, but those are some of them that just...
I'm sure these beliefs and the suspicions, all the viewers who haven't read it yet were going to be very excited to read it and go and check all of these things out. So like you said, I just asked you which story was your favorite. So tell me, which story was the hardest to translate? I mean, which was the story which took you a lot of time and a lot of thinking and everything to translate it properly like you did?
So for Apurva and I both, like I said, we conferred a lot on how to translate the different stories. And some of the different stories, because they, like I said, in their romance-like vein, they're approaching reality in different ways. And so actually the structure and language would change. And so this would kind of create new challenges. So I would say two of them which were particularly difficult. One is a story called The Mughal Sultanate and the Bishti, which is kind of located in Mughal-era India. And I think a lot of translators struggle with the question of how do you capture the feeling of a time period through the vocabulary, which doesn't necessarily have an equivalent in English. So, in trying to recreate the Durbar of the Mughal court, we felt like we should use words like Amir and Amir Hajib, and things like that. Whereas if you put a medieval or kind of like terms within the medieval tradition of Europe, it wouldn't kind of create the same feel. But that also created the difficulty where, because there are so many words that were somewhat foreign that we were importing into the language, it caused this tension of how do you make the story read fluidly and read naturally when you're confronted with a lot of new terminologies, on every other word. So we partially addressed that with the glossary, but we did our best to make sure that the story was self-evident in the way that it told itself. Another story, which was very difficult, was She. And this was difficult for a very different reason, in the sense that here the author was touching upon a lot of very sort of metaphysical themes. It's a story about the author's relationship and contemplation of beauty. But the title of the story in Hindi is just Waha. And every time, this muse, this goddess, beauty, whatever she is, and the story is referred to, it's just as Waha. And so, in Hindi, there's a nice ambivalence and non-determinacy to certain terms where one thing can actually mean many different things. Whereas in English, is it he, she, or it? Which one is it? And language will just force you to have to make a decision. So the challenge of this story was to make sure that, within the confines of English, you could allow for as many interpretations as possible, because if the story is working on multiple levels, you want all of those levels to come through. You don't want it to be, any single one.
Yeah, so nice. So tell me that there were a lot of reviews and everything. In one of the reviews, I read that this book where Narayan tries to take out the human through the inhuman. So this phase is the phase that the human through the inhuman just got me hooked, and it's so deep. So would you like to just put some light onto it? Like, what does it actually try to surface and mean? Or what you thought the review had to say, or what you think, what is your view about it?
Yeah. So one of one of the questions which Narayan asks, not just in his stories, but also in a lot of his poetry, and this is kind of what I was explaining, trying to get at before, is, what does it mean to be human? And also the question of, like, what does it mean to survive as human? And so I think that part of what he links, being human to, is also this concept of innocence, in a type of subtle way at looking at the world, which is not based purely on our own self-interest, or what we can get out of things. So, if you say things like, oh, he, showed great humanity in his actions, well, that was a very human thing to do. There's something that we mean by that. And I think what he probes is like this virtue of subtle thinking, and I think there's possibly a correlation between the way in which we try to think through things in a very sort of distinct and particular way, a singular way, versus making very kind of broad categorizations. So like I said before, often, when we create abstractions, which are types of categories, we say, this person is like this, that person is like that, happiness is happiness, love is love, a human is a human. But I think, Narayan, as a sort of investigative poet, is really using these stories to question, a lot of these precepts. There's one story called Achala and Achal, where the girl says that, she loves the boy, and the boy, thinks about what it means to love her, and he thinks, okay, I think given all of my different needs in life, I can maybe afford 40% of love. I can maybe love 40%. It's a bit ridiculous because when we think about love, we think, okay, this is, infinite, this is absolute,
unconditional,
unconditional, this is transcendent. And so you see Narayan doing this on many occasions where he takes something which we perceive, to be, absolute in some way, in another context that's, happiness. And then he kind of tries to... and I don't think it would be easy to say that, one of the reasons that, he's a great writer is that there's a paradox, in his work. And so it's not like he's saying, that one shouldn't love unconditionally. Compassion is there. And yet also what he's questioning, though, is that all of the worldly trappings and external compulsions that love exists within, and how those have to be navigated. So I would say that, like I said before, there's an act, how we see things, our perception, and being able to recognize in the other what is human. And that is not just, with other people. I think it can also be with nature. It can be with, the sky, or, if we're thinking about, things beyond, what is purely earthly. And again, I think that Apurva does a very good job where he tries to kind of dissect some of this in the afterword.
Yeah, maybe that's why Narayan's known as the finest and the greatest thinkers of all, because his thinking is really beyond what a person can, and that's what he portrays it in his stories. So that's the most amazing part about it. So we're almost at the end of the show. So just tell me your altogether experience, and would you want to translate more such nice, great beauties in the upcoming thing? And how is the response there? Your in all experience, and how do you like it and everything?
My overall experience is definitely, there are a lot of metaphors for translation, but I think it's helpful to try to think about the work that you're doing in terms of the way in which the original artist or author was thinking about it. One of the ways that Narayan thought about writing and translation of things is, the idea of having a conversation, to be in dialogue with something. And definitely, for this experience, I was in dialogue with a different language, in dialogue with a different culture, in dialogue with a different translator, in dialogue with a lot of my own belief systems. And so once you kind of go through the process, and it is very much a relational process, you come out transformed, having learned something new. So I would definitely encourage others to translate. I would encourage others to read the book to be transformed in the same way that I was. And definitely translation is something I'm going to continue to be doing in the future.